One more thing.
So thank you, Ed. I would note for those of you who have been following this that the introductions have become less glowing and dramatically briefer the longer we've done it. The first couple of times, Ed built me up to a point where I got really excited about listening to the guy until I realized it was me. But now we're back down to a more normal. And as all of you know, I'm a very big fan of the work that Heritage did in the Reagan years. Attorney General Meese is here, and he knows how big an impact Heritage had in the initial phase. And so I really think that what Heritage is doing this time in the transition is very much in the tradition of what they did back in 1980 and 1981, and I'm honored to be able to come and to share with you. This is the fifth of a series we're doing in January. We also did a speech on December 13th on the principles of Trump and Trumpism, and a speech at the National Defense University on December 14th on national security and Trump. And the final speech will be, I think, Monday. And then this set of a total of 6 speeches this month and 2 earlier speeches are the core of what will be a book in the spring on understanding Trump, and an effort to really put it in context. And something happened this morning that I think is a perfect lead-in to both understanding Trump and to thinking about the inaugural address in a much more profound and fundamental way than the elite media is capable of. And that is that Trump this morning tweeted about launching an investigation into illegal voting. And I was on Fox this morning, and I was asked, gee, isn't this a diversion? Why are we still focused on the election? And I tried to explain that a number of us have felt for a very long time that dead people voting is inappropriate, non-citizens voting is inappropriate, that it is legitimate to actually ask for an identity system where we know that the person voting is both alive and legal, and that every time we get into this, Democrats start screaming racism, which leads me to believe they have a large vested interest in illegal voting. Now, I was getting ready for this speech, and I want to go show you the continuity of Trump and the seriousness of Trump, which nobody in the elite media can cope with, because he is so outside their world that they keep looking at individual dots. It's like looking at one dot on the wall and failing to recognize that it's part of 700 dots that make up a rhinoceros. And so the news media goes from dot to dot in constant amazement and confusion. This is Trump speaking at Gettysburg in October. Quote, "The system is totally rigged and broken. First, the issue of voter fraud." So this morning's tweet goes back to a speech at Gettysburg, which nobody apparently in the news media could figure out because it's so far away and so complicated to use the internet to track these things down, or to have somebody in your news organization whose job is to know what Trump has already said. This is Trump again. According to Pew, there are 24 million voter registrations in the United States that are either invalid or significantly inaccurate. And when I say that there are such inaccuracies, it's unbelievable. 1.8 million dead people are registered to vote, and some of them are voting. I wonder how that happens. 2.8 million people are registered in more than one state. These are the numbers, folks. These are the numbers. 14% of non-citizens are registered to vote, close quote. So the elite media doesn't want to cope with it, but the fact is Donald J. Trump has been saying consistently as a candidate and as president, we have a problem with voter fraud in America. And there are several states where the Democrats are going to be in real trouble if only legal citizens are allowed to vote, live legal citizens. So this is not a trivial thing, but I thought the more important point was it showed you the continuity that Trump is engaged in. That these are not just things that are passing moments where he wakes up and says, oh, gee, I think I'll tweet about illegal voting. Or I think this is in fact a thematic about the corruption of America by political machines who have a vested interest in voting people who are either dead or illegal because they can't win in an election that only involves people who are legal citizens of the United States and alive, which are, I think, 2 reasonable criteria for being allowed to vote. So, I want to start actually at the end of the inaugural address because I think it gives you the rhythm and the drive and the flavor that we're now seeing. The news media is beginning to realize that as an entrepreneur, who's also in many ways an existentialist, and by that I mean Donald Trump lives in the moment. He is totally engaged, he has total energy, he is totally focused, and that's true all day long. And he gets by with less sleep than most people I've ever met, and he does so with more energy than anyone I've ever met. I mean, he really is in the Theodore Roosevelt tradition of just pure energy. And part of the reason he's pure energy is he loves what he's doing. And he loves being at the center of attention. And he's figured out a way to really be at the center of attention. He's President of the United States. I mean, you know, if what you need to wrap up your life is having lots of attention, being president's a pretty... So he gets up every morning, and the first thing he knows every morning is he's Donald Trump and he's president, and you're not. And so this gives him an enormous level of energy. And he then takes that energy and turns it into decisions, which again is part of really what confuses the elite media. Trump is not an academic. He's not a theoretician. He doesn't take his enormous energy and turn it into words. He paints with action. And it's by understanding his actions that you begin to understand what he's doing and how he's doing it. Now, I would argue that the inaugural, in fact, was a very well done speech. And that when he has to, he can actually put together a very compelling, powerful statement. But that's not his first instinct. His first instinct is to make a decision and enforce it and inspect it and make sure it happens. So here's how he closed the inaugural, which I think was very compelling. And this sort of leads into what you've seen in the last few days. He says, "The time for empty talk is over. Now arrives the hour of action." That's a reasonably good warning. Do not allow anyone to tell you that it cannot be done. No challenge can match the heart and fight and spirit of America. We will not fail. And by the way, I suspect he looked at the demonstrations on Saturday as the personification of exactly that point. They want to challenge him and they want to challenge the American people, fine. They can put on really weird hats and use really nasty language and dream of blowing up the White House, and they will lose. So he goes on to say, our country will thrive and prosper again. And this is part of why I'm intrigued with how he's going to live this out. The next paragraph. We stand at the birth of a new millennium, ready to unlock the mysteries of space, to free the earth from the miseries of disease, and to harness the energies, industries, and technologies of tomorrow. A new national pride will stir ourselves, lift our sights, and heal our divisions. This is almost John F. Kennedy quality, a very similar pattern. Optimistic, positive, science and technology-based, moving to a dramatically better future. And it'll be interesting to see as they go through budget fights and other things, how do they develop a totally new approach of public-private partnership that actually dramatically accelerates science in solving disease and getting into space and creating jobs and strengthening national security. Quote, and I thought this was very compelling and it's very disappointing, not unexpected, but disappointing that the elite media so totally failed to pick up on this next part. It's time to remember that old wisdom our soldiers will never forget. That whether we are black or brown or white, we all bleed the same red blood of patriots. We all enjoy the same glorious freedoms, and we all salute the same great American flag. Now, that's the second point in the speech where he repudiates racism of any kind. And you would have thought that the press would have thought this is a good thing. But of course, they had to rush in first to report that he had taken out Martin Luther King Jr.'s bust from the White House because their theme is he has to be a racist because he's a Republican conservative, so how can he not be a racist? Because after all, if he's not a racist and he starts getting black and Latino votes based on values other than racism, the Democratic Party won't come back for at least 50 years. And so this is outside their mantra, but for the country, when you talk about this was not a divisive speech. This is a speech that talks about bringing us together, which, of course, is totally outside the New York Times, CBS News mean of trying to describe what's going on. He goes on to say, whether a child is born in the urban sprawl of Detroit or the windswept plains of Nebraska, They look up at the same night sky. They fill their heart with the same dreams, and they are infused with the breath of life by the same almighty Creator. So to all Americans, in every city near and far, small and large, from mountain to mountain, from ocean to ocean, hear these words: you will never be ignored again. Your voice, your hopes, and your dreams will define our American destiny. And your courage and goodness and love will forever guide us along the way. Now, if a liberal Democrat had said those paragraphs, the New York Times would have swooned. NBC would have devoted an entire special to the genius of the inauguration. They would have talked about how he is bringing us together. I mean, this is language of togetherness. It's a language of the whole country working on the same themes. Repudiated, of course, the next day by a group of vulgar, hostile, and determined nihilists of the left. And repudiated that day by young fascists running around breaking windows and harassing people. But he's talking about unity. He's trying to bring us together. And then he closes in what I thought, and Calista and I both talked about it afterwards when we were still on the dais and still just deeply impacted by this. He says, together we will make America strong again. We will make America wealthy again. We will make America proud again. We will make America safe again. And yes, together we will make America great again. Now, part of the reason I want to start with his close is he's gone right back to the campaign. This is not a stupid man. This was the theme which allowed him to beat 16 other Republicans. This is the theme which allowed him to beat the elite news media. This is the theme which allowed him to beat a $1 billion campaign by Hillary Clinton. And of course, it shocks all the liberals because it turns out he may actually have meant what he campaigned on, which people voted for, and that puts him so outside liberalism and so outside the traditional establishment that it's unthinkable. Therefore, it can't be true. And yet this speech, this inaugural, grows directly out of a 2-year campaign and has now led into the first week of activism, which, guess what, happens to reflect the campaign. What's he focusing on? Job creation, immigration, shrinking government, all the things he campaigned on. And guess what that probably means? He's probably going to continue to do just this. I was also struck at the very beginning of the inaugural with the intensity of the use of we. We just had a president who found it hard to get through a sentence without the word I, and who I think in one speech had, Sean Hannity claimed last night, had 79 I's in one speech, which, if you were Obama, made perfect sense, because to Obama, the entire thing was about him. And he was always puzzled by all those other people. But Trump, who in many ways you can caricature as focused on himself and talking about his campaign and, having things that are huge. But listen to how he opens. We, the citizens of America, are now joined in a great national effort to rebuild our country and restore its promise for all of our people. Now, you can take that opening sentence and build an 8-year administration around it and remind every appointee and every civil servant and everybody in the House and Senate. What is this about? What is the Trumpian revolution about? It's about the citizens joined in a great national effort, rebuilding the country and restoring its promise for all of our citizens. And I can tell you, we went through a dialogue on this in the spring and went from Make America Great Again to Make America Great Again for all Americans, and beginning to consciously, and which really reached its apex in a speech at an African-American church in Detroit in September, and a speech in Charlotte in October where he talked about a New Deal for African-Americans. And it's a very conscious statement by Trump at the very beginning of the inaugural that his commitment is to all Americans. And again, contrast this with the young fascists who are running around demonstrating, spitting on Gold Star families, harassing people trying to go either to the inaugural or the ball, breaking windows in an act of total nihilism, or the following day, the hostility, which I have to say, part of me found it humorous that if you weren't left enough, that it didn't count. So the folks who were there who represented the transgender community were offended that the people who represented feminism hadn't been inclusive enough, early enough, and they weren't sure that pure feminists should be allowed to come because they weren't necessarily equal to the task. And if males were there, they wondered why the males were there, even if they were totally supportive, because it wasn't really appropriate. I mean, you have to read the coverage of all the different factions who hate it. They hate each other. I mean, they don't just hate Trump. They hate each other. Which is why it's very hard. They can't have a Tea Party movement because they're not happy enough to be a party. So, notice how he continues with this language. Together, we will determine the course of America and the world for many, many years to come. And again, I think he really does understand that as President of the United States and leader of the United States, he ultimately, inevitably, is a leader for the planet. We're too big an economy, we're too strong militarily, we have too great a dominance in culture to just think of ourselves. So while he wants to put America first, he wants to put America first within a world system in which he's deeply aware that we are tied to the entire planet. We will face challenges, we will confront hardships, but we will get the job done. And it's important to understand this part of him. I remember talking to him, I think it was in early October when we were sort of at one of the bottom points of the campaign. And he said, we were on the phone, and he said, "Remember, I will win." So at the very lowest moments, he had to think through, he wasn't quite sure yet how he would win. They hadn't made the final decision to go for Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, but they knew that the conversation they were going to have is, okay, how are we going to win? It wasn't, how are we going to lose? Or maybe we should give up. Or, we just can't do it. And so this deep part of Trump, which he wants to imbue in the entire country, don't talk about disabilities, talk about capabilities. Look at the Wounded Warrior Program and ask yourself, for every American who's on disability, what is it they can do? Not what is it they can't do. Look at every person who currently is on welfare and on food stamps and ask, is there a way to get them to a job? Look at every person who currently is unemployed and ask, what can I do to help small businesses hire people? In Colorado alone, I was talking with Senator Cory Gardner, who pointed out that there are about 200,000 businesses in Colorado, and if each just hired one more person, you just added 200,000 people to the workforce, 200,000 people paying taxes, 200,000 people taking care of their families. So the Trump mindset is to look at problems and turn them into opportunities, and to figure out how are we going to now make the transition from this problem to this opportunity. He then makes an assertion, and this is why I thought in many ways that this related directly to Lincoln, as I talked about the other day. He says, quote, "We are not merely transferring power from one administration to another or from one party to another, but we are transferring power from Washington, D.C. and giving it back to the American people." Now, at this point, he's making an assertion for uniqueness, which we have not truly heard since 1861. And he's saying the consequence, and this is why, while the margin may have been narrow and the election may have been in the Electoral College, et cetera, the fact is the scale of the decision was enormous. Down this road is Clinton, the old order, even more radical court. Down this road is an entrepreneurial driving conservatism that's pro-free market with a conservative court. This may have been as wide an election choice as any of us have seen in our lifetime. And it's in that context that he's saying, look, this is not a normal inaugural. This is a historic event. He says, and this is his condemnation of the old order in both parties. And those reporters, and again, this is one of those things where the argument over the size of the crowd and the argument over the nastiness of the demonstrators drown out what should have been a very serious focus of the national media, because he is making a specific condemnation. And it's very powerful. He says, quote, "Politicians prospered, but the jobs left and the factories closed. The establishment protected itself, but not the citizens of our country. Their victories have not been your victories. Their triumphs have not been your triumphs. And while they celebrated in our nation's capital, there was little to celebrate for struggling families all across the land." Now, first of all, this is very, very good language, and very clear and very compelling. He goes on to say, that all changes starting right here and right now, because this moment is your moment. It belongs to you. No, and I have to confess, having watched him over the last few years, I wasn't sure if he was going to get up and be a little bit of a hot dog and say a little bit of what he said at the CIA, that this moment's my moment, I got here and you didn't, But he didn't. I mean, look at the statesmanship. Look at the discipline. And look at the desire to communicate with every American that this administration is about you. It's not about Donald Trump. He fails if it's about Donald Trump. But he succeeds if he convinces his entire team that they serve the people. He goes on to say, what truly matters is not which party controls our government, but whether our government is controlled by the people. And this is pure Lincoln. And as I cited the other day, with help from Dr. Guelzo at Gettysburg College, this reliance on the sovereignty of the people is at the heart of both of American populism and of the whole sense of what makes both Lincoln and Trump so different. He goes on to say, January 20th, 2017 will be remembered as the day the people became the rulers of this nation again. Now, I believe that what that leads to is very dramatic civil service reform. And I believe that because today, the bureaucracy and the lawyers run the country. And to truly enact what he is describing, he will have to reform the civil service so that, in fact, it is responsive to the nation's elected leadership. And that will be a very significant struggle and a very real challenge. So I think that it's important to go back. I recommend all of you to read the entire speech slowly. Think about it, underline it. This is a very thoughtful, very profound statement of a fundamentally different direction for America by somebody who has earned the right to tell us what he honestly thinks, because his campaigning, his courage, nobody else could have done what he did. I don't know of anybody else who could have come out of nowhere and beaten 16 Republican candidates. I don't know of anybody else who could have taken on the entire elite media and beaten them. I don't know of anybody else who could have taken on $1 billion Hillary campaign and won. Occasionally people say to me, oh, some other Republican would have won by a bigger margin. Baloney. I've been through a lot of campaigns in my career. It took force of will. It took a willingness to confront her. It took a willingness to be tough. And I don't know of any other candidate who could have done it the way he did it. So he's earned the right to tell us these things. And then there's a passage I just want to share because it's the perfect example of why the left and why the elite media has such a hard time dealing with Trump. He says, quote, "The American carnage stops right here and stops right now." And many people in the media said that was such a dark term. What does he mean by carnage? Now, there were 4,000 people shot in Chicago last year. And Chicago per capita was third. St. Louis was first, Baltimore was second. Now, if 4,000 people being shot in your third largest city isn't close to carnage, what would it take? But see, the elite media doesn't care. They didn't fit any of the patterns. Notice how little coverage we've gotten. Southside Chicago is a war zone. And how many newspapers and how many TV shows have actually gone in And how can Rahm Emanuel preside over this human disaster and not think it's carnage? And you watch what's about to happen. Trump today is signing an order on sanctuary cities. Part of that order, something that Attorney General Meese will remember, we historically assigned federal immigration personnel to co-locate with our major jails. And when an illegal alien got out of jail, they got on a bus and they were last seen leaving the country. Now, the whole sanctuary city process kicked out the federal agents. So we currently release onto the street the criminal who's here illegally, who should be leaving. And I can't wait to see Rahm Emanuel explain why Chicago needs more murderers and more rapists on the street. And that's what this is very practical stuff. I mean, Trump's not talking theory. Trump is talking about very practical things. You first saw this when he first began talking about illegal aliens who had killed people. And then he would bring up, when the media said, oh, it's not really true, it doesn't really happen, he'd start to bring up on stage families of people who'd been killed. And all of a sudden, average, normal, everyday Americans went, wait a second, why doesn't the New York Times understand this is real? And of course, they had all sorts of theoretical explanations. I was reminded of the nuttiness of part of the Dukakis campaign, where Dukakis had ended up vetoing a bill that required school teachers to say the Pledge of Allegiance. And liberal attorneys understood that there was a theoretical explanation. Wasn't true, by the way. The Supreme Court had upheld the right to say, if you hold a public job, we can ask you to say the Pledge of Allegiance. It's different than could we compel you as a citizen to say it. But in order to hold a public job, we could ask you to say it. And you ended up with the Attorney General of Massachusetts on the Today Show explaining why it made sense to veto the Pledge of Allegiance. And as one of the people trying to help George H.W. Bush win, I mean, I found myself watching that morning thinking, can we book him some more? And that's what this fight's going to be like. I mean, if liberal Democratic mayors and liberal Democratic governors and liberal Democratic members of the House and Senate want to jump up and explain, no, we should not get rid of criminals, we should allow them back on the street. You can't explain that. I mean, it is so irrational. And so if you watch it, you see Trump beginning to talk about it, but he's talking about a world they don't believe in. You know, if you're a tenured faculty member at Stanford, you don't quite notice the violence in San Francisco. If you're a tenured faculty member at the University of Chicago, such as the last president, you apparently don't notice the violence 2 miles away. But if you're normal people, you know it's dangerous, you know it's wrong, you know Americans shouldn't be at risk. And that's why I think you're going to see a series of actions that will drive the left crazy. But for most Americans will simply be common sense. And that's frankly what we are now dealing with. One last thing. He says, quote, from this day forward, a new vision will govern our land. From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first. Now, first of all, the from this day forward does sound a lot like John F. Kennedy. But second, think about it. He's the president of the United States. He's not the president of the International Order. He's not the president of the Paris Conference on something or other. He's the president of one country. And the left, of course, promptly says America first must mean Lindbergh and the neutrality against the Nazis in 1937 to 1940, which it takes, frankly, a fair amount of sophistication and stupidity combined. It gets us back to Nassim Taleb's essay on intellectual yet idiot, because it's fairly clear Donald Trump has no reference at all to either Lindbergh, the Nazis, or 1937 debates about American policy. But he goes on to say something that's very, very important and should comfort people who worry about exactly what does this all mean. Because he says, I'm going to find the exact quote, he says, quote, it is the right of all nations to put their own interest first. We do not seek to impose our way of life on anyone, but rather to let it shine as an example. We will shine for everyone to follow. He goes on to say, We will reinforce old alliances and form new ones and unite the civilized world against radical Islamic terrorism, which we will eradicate from the face of the earth. But at the bedrock of our politics will be a total allegiance to the United States of America. Now, notice what he's saying here. He's saying, first of all, if he negotiates with Mexico, and when he meets with the Mexican president later on, guess what he expects the Mexican president to do? He expects him to represent Mexico. He's just asking for the right to represent America. Now, in the U.S. State Department, this is such a radical idea. Because the core, and part of it grew out of a historic anomaly. In 1945, we were over half the world's gross product, because we were the only major country that hadn't been bombed. And so, I mean, we'd found a perfect way to compete with Mercedes and Toyota. We bombed them. It's not a technique you can use often. And it happened as, you know, as an accident of history. So in the late 40s and early 50s, in order to sustain a worldwide anti-Soviet coalition, we got in a habit of using economics to subsidize policy. And it was a perfectly rational thing. We were so enormous compared to everybody else. We were so much wealthier. My dad, who served in the Army for 27 years, used to talk about going back home as the land of the big PX. That there were so many things to buy. There were so many opportunities. And gradually, over a period of 60 years, we succeeded. The Soviet Union disappeared. Other countries became wealthier. And we're now at a point in time when we need to have a fundamental adjustment from what had been a use American resources to subsidize the planet to represent American interests. Not represent American interest in trying to crush anybody else, but represent American interest in honest negotiations where both sides are allowed to walk in a room and say, look, this is what I need and this is what I can't do. And Trump's pretty good at this. It's going to be fascinating to watch. It'll be fascinating to watch how he directs and trains the people around him, because he has a vision of how to get this done. So the last point I'll make about the speech in general is it has references to God, references to a supreme being, and I think combined with the 6 prayers that day, the most we've ever had at Inaugural, it says something profound. Trump is not a publicly religious person, but I do think Trump is a person who believes that without God's help he wouldn't have become president. And I think he believes that he does have a moral obligation to, as he said during the campaign, to defend, for example, Christians who are being persecuted in the Middle East. And I think he does think in that sense that religion matters and that being concerned about religion matters, and that is central. Now, I want to take the closing few minutes and tie Trump into the essay that Ed talked about, which I think is so profound. I want to share a good bit of it with you. Trump at Gettysburg, in his opening lines, says, quote, this is Trump on October 22nd, which is, I think, the most important speech of the campaign, because it's where he outlines his concept of a contract with the American voter, and he has a whole list of very big changes that he wants to achieve. And I recommend it to everybody who wants some sense of the administration. He says, quote, it is my privilege to be here in Gettysburg, hallowed ground, where so many lives were given in service to freedom, an amazing place. President Lincoln served at a time of division like we've never seen before. It is my hope that we can look at his example to heal the divisions we are living through right now. We are a very divided nation, close quote. Now let me say, first of all, Lincoln began to reunify us after winning the war. And it's very important. And I actually think in terms of dealing with Islamic supremacism that we're going to find ourselves studying Lincoln, who at one point locked up half the Maryland legislature. Because Lincoln understood that he had to fight subversion at home. And it will make, in fact, the bombers who bombed the World Trade Center the first time in 1993 were tried under a sedition act that was passed in the Civil War by Lincoln, because we were faced with domestic threats. And we're not used to talking about that. And the left worked so hard to avoid telling the truth about Soviet agents and Soviet espionage that they immediately go rigid when you discuss these kind of things. But here's what Dennis Prager wrote, and I was very struck by it. I agree with Ed that it is a very sobering. I recommend it to all of you. It's entitled America's Second Civil War by Dennis Prager. Quote, It is time that our society acknowledge a sad truth. America is currently fighting its second civil war. In fact, with the obvious and enormous exception of attitudes toward slavery, Americans are more divided morally, ideologically, and politically today than they were during the Civil War. For that reason, just as the Great War came to be known as the First World War once there was a Second World War, the Civil War will become known as the First Civil War when more Americans come to regard the current battle as the Second Civil War. The Second Civil War, fortunately, differs in one other critically important way. It has thus far been largely nonviolent. But given the increasing left-wing violence, such as riots, the violent taking over of college presidents' offices, and the illegal occupation of state capitals, nonviolence is not guaranteed to be a permanent characteristic of the Second Civil War. There are those on both the left and the right who call for American unity, but these calls are either naive or disingenuous. Unity was possible between the right and liberals, but not between the right and the left. Liberalism, which was anti-left, pro-American, and deeply committed to the Judeo-Christian foundation of America, regarded the melting pot as the American ideal, fought for free speech for its opponents, regarded Western civilization as the greatest moral and artistic human achievement, and viewed the celebration of racial identity as racism. It is now affirmed almost exclusively on the right and among a handful of people who don't call themselves conservative. The left, however, is opposed to every one of those core principles of liberalism. Like the left in every other country, the left in America sees America as essentially a racist, xenophobic, colonialist, imperialist, warmongering, money-worshipping, moronically religious nation. Just as in Western Europe, the left in America seeks to erase America's Judeo-Christian foundations. The melting pot is regarded as nothing more than an anti-black, anti-Muslim, anti-Hispanic meme. The left suppresses free speech wherever possible for those who oppose it, labeling all non-left speech hate speech. To cite only one example, if you think Shakespeare was the greatest playwright or Bach the greatest composer, you are a proponent of dead white European males and therefore racist. Without any important value held in common, how can there be unity between left and non-left? Obviously, there cannot. There will be unity only where the left vanquishes the right or the right vanquishes the left. Using the first Civil War analogy, American unity was achieved only after the South was vanquished and slavery abolished. How are those of us who oppose left-wing nihilism? There is no other word for an ideology that holds Western civilization and America's core values in contempt, supposed to unite with educators is in quotes, who instruct elementary school teachers to cease calling their students boys and girls because that implies gender identity. With English departments that don't require reading Shakespeare in order to receive a degree in English, with those who regard virtually every war America fought as imperialist and immoral, with those who regard the free market as a form of repression, with those who want the state to control as much of American life as possible, with those who repeatedly tell America and its black minority that the greatest problems afflicting black Americans are all caused by white racism, white privilege, and systemic racism, with those who think that the nuclear family ideal is inherently misogynistic and homophobic, with those who hold that Israel is the villain in the Middle East, with those who claim that the term Islamic terrorist is an expression of religious bigotry. The third significant difference between the First and Second Civil Wars is that one side has been doing nearly all the fighting. That is how it has been able to take over schools, from elementary schools to high schools to universities, and indoctrinate America's young people, how it has taken over nearly all the news media, and how it has taken over the entertainment media. The conservative side is lost on every one of these fronts because it has rarely fought back with anything near the ferocity with which the left fights. Name a Republican politician who has run against the left as opposed to running solely against his or her Democratic opponent. And nearly all American conservatives, people who are proud of America and affirm its basic tenets, readily send their children to schools that indoctrinate their children against everything the parents hold precious. A mere handful protest when their child's teacher ceases calling their son a boy or their daughter a girl, or makes slave owner the defining characteristic of the Founding Fathers. With the defeat of the left in the last presidential election, the defeat of the left in two-thirds of the gubernatorial elections, and in a majority of House and Senate elections, this is likely the last chance liberals, conservatives, and the right have to defeat the American left. But it will not happen until these groups understand that we are fighting for the survival of America no less than the Union troops were in the First Civil War. I think Prager has it exactly right. I think that's what the violence on Friday meant. I think that's what the vicious, vulgar hostility on Saturday meant. I think that's what the news media hostility on Sunday meant. And I think that it's important for us to understand this is going to go on every single day because they are embattled. And if we do what we promised to do, if we do what Trump promised in his inaugural, we will be in a fight consistently from now until either we win or they win. And I think that's why this is so important. And if it's okay, I think I have a few minutes to toss it up for questions. All right. Now, let's see. I think we have microphones, right? Okay. This lady right down here.
Good morning, Barbara Bowie Whitman. You give me hope. After supporting some of the other 16, 3 in order as a matter of fact, came around and gave a little bit of money to our new president and voted for him. But I was discouraged after standing for 4 hours on the Capitol grounds the other day because our tickets turned out to be standing room. That was not my discouragement. My discouragement was what he had to say. So I am encouraged by hearing your interpretation of it. Let me tell you why I was discouraged and see how you answer my point. And that is that when he talked about protection, what he talks about in the field of trade, to me, is mercantilism. It is a philosophy that I do not believe can do this country good, and I think promoting the concept that our losses in manufacturing are mostly due to trade, and if we tear up trade agreements, we're going to do better, is not doing a service to the American public. I'm worried about it. I like most of his ideas, but his concepts of going back to whoever holds the most goods and the most gold is in better shape than the others worries me a lot.
Well, it doesn't worry me. First of all, the most popular Broadway musical of modern times is about Hamilton. Hamilton represented an economic policy based on building up the American economy through discriminatory tariffs. That philosophy dominated the country until the 1930s. The Republican Party was built as a party that believed on tariffs and railroads and manufacturing. When the Chinese steal $460 billion in intellectual property in 1 year, which was what the Director of National Intelligence Staff reported earlier last year, I think you have a trade problem. And yes, I understand all the arguments that in theory we would have lost all these jobs, et cetera. I don't know that that's true. I think that you look, there are circumstances, for example, in virtually every country, it is harder for Americans to import into that country than it is for that country to import in the United States. So that's just an objective reality. When we do get dominance in technology, for example, Google and Facebook, where there are no European competitors, the answer of the Brussels bureaucracy is to try to find a way, to rip up our companies. I'd be very happy to compete with Japan or China in a whole range of products if they would let us have the same access to their country. And so, you can't, and this is where Trump really understands a profound thing as a businessman. To talk about free trade in a world of controlled trade is to let yourself be totally open to exploitation. Now, the contract, which worked for the elites for a long time, was the price of your goods is going to be so low at Walmart that your standard of living will go up by having an open trading system. And that worked as long as people had jobs. But when people start realizing, wait a second, I can't afford to go to Walmart. So it doesn't help me to know I could buy cheap Chinese goods if I could afford cheap Chinese goods, because I'm now unemployed. And that's where the contract broke down. And then, of course, you have the left, which wants to wage war on coal. Well, guess what? If you're in a fairly large section of America, waging war on coal is waging war on you. People don't translate this. There's a reason that the Democrats have taken one of their most solid states, West Virginia, and destroyed the Democratic Party. There's a reason Manchin votes with Trump. It's the only hope he has of survival.
I led a team that helped carry West Virginia for Bush in 2000.
Okay.
Been there.
But it's gotten bigger and bigger to a point now where they can't survive. Yes, sir. He'll bring you a microphone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Leon Peace, the Peace Group. Mr. Speaker, when you were Speaker of the House, following large votes, especially with respect to the contract with America, you had the practice of returning to the floor just before the building shut down, and you would read into the record certain speeches with your ideas and your vision for America.
Right.
Now, to date, I haven't heard you take credit for that or promote that or et cetera, but I used to sit there and listen to them. I was wondering, do you plan to offer those ideas and those suggestions to the new president? Some of those ideas were so progressive they could have been offered by any Democrat, and it was certainly one of the most outstanding times of our
Well, I mean,
of your
look,
speakership.
I try to share with the administration in a variety of ways, including speaking at Heritage, so that that they know. But I think there are a lot of smart people trying to move in the right direction. I mean, I don't think we should underestimate how smart Paul Ryan is, how smart Chairman Brady is at Ways and Means. I mean, how smart Chairman Alexander and Chairman Upton were in passing the 21st Century Cures Bill. I mean, there are a lot of smart people working very hard right now, including, frankly, the cabinet that this president's pulled together. This is, I think, the most, without all due respects to Attorney General Meese and the Reagan team, I think this is a stronger cabinet than anyone since Eisenhower in '53. If you look at their objective, what they accomplished out in the world. I mean, these are really remarkable people, and the fact he could talk him into coming in gives him, I think, a level of energy and drive and a desire to win that's quite unusual. Yes?
From the Hindu American Foundation. You mentioned, or President Trump has mentioned radical Islamic terrorism as something that we need to wipe out, but he also acknowledges the fact that countries are going to operate in the manner in which they see is in their best interest. There are more countries who acknowledge Islam as their state religion in the United Nations than any other. How is this going to be possible if the OIC is the largest vote bank in the United Nations, and considering that radical Islamic terrorism is also entrenched in countries whose constitutions are built on repressing minorities, such as Pakistan?
I think first of all, it's a challenge, but one of the things that was underreported in this country is the president of Egypt, al-Sisi, going to the most important single university in Islam and publicly lecturing the professors on the need to modernize Islam and saying bluntly, we are currently trapped into a medieval environment in which everybody in the world is afraid of us. And he said, we cannot function this way. The king of Jordan has worked very diligently to track down and defeat radical Islam. The king of Morocco has done the same. Now, the challenge for Americans is that it may well be that authoritarian regimes that are willing to destroy radical Islam are safer for America than efforts at democratization that put the Muslim Brotherhood and radical Islam in power, and that we have to come to grips with that reality. I think the actual act of wiping it out, as he suggests here in his inaugural, is going to be a very difficult, long fight. And I would say to you that the United Nations will either come to grips with the modern world, or the modern world will eventually shrink the importance of the United Nations radically. I mean, the National Security Council sellout by Obama, which is what it was, the deliberate betrayal of Israel, will not stand. And something will be done to change that. I have no doubt. And actually, nobody's yet put together the number of anti-Israel things that the Obama administration did in the last few weeks of their administration is stunning, and tells you where his heart really was. And I think it tells you how big the gap is between the team that's now in and the team that just got defeated. I think this gentleman right here.
Thank you and Heritage so much for this great series. Really enjoyed it. At his speech last week, the president said that we're going to follow two simple rules, to buy American and hire American. It has been widely reported as we speak, the administration is continuing to process, just during the last hour, 100 work permits for illegal aliens in this country at the expense of American workers. Are you surprised that he has not reversed DACA yet, and do you expect that he will do so soon?
I don't know what he'll do about DACA. I'm personally very dubious. I mean, if you ask me, again, a lesson I learned from studying under Ronald Reagan, If you have a choice between an 80-20 issue your way and an 80-20 issue against you, try to pick the one that's for you. So Reagan, for example, wanted to cut taxes, and Walter Mondale got up and said proudly in San Francisco, you know, I promise you I will raise your taxes if you elect me. And I was part of a truth squad that year in San Francisco. We actually closed our operation because we didn't want to get between Mondale and the American people. On the grounds that Woodrow Wilson had once said that you should never murder a man who's in the process of committing suicide. So I would say to you, if you ask my advice on what fight to pick, I love fighting over getting criminals in big city jails and taking them directly from the big city jail to the border, because that's an 80 or 90% issue. If you ask me, do I want to go after people who came here at 2 years of age, speak English fluently, have lived their entire life here, and graduated as a valedictorian from their local high school? I think that's not a very smart fight. And I think in the long run, I personally believe in the long run, we are not going to deport them. I think that an effort to deport them would turn every church in the country into a sanctuary. And so I think we ought to be honest about it. I mean, Trump is about being honest. Well, let's be honest. If you're a criminal, you ought to be gone. And in fact, we ought to figure out ways to make getting rid of you easy. If you try to come across the border now, we should stop you. We have no reason to register more people. But I'd be very cautious about taking the 700,000 people who have signed up, followed the law, done exactly what they were asked to do, and saying we're now going to hunt you down. And I think that, so again, and I'm very much for being tough on immigration. I'm very much for controlling the border, 100%. But I think that you ought to figure out which fights you need to start with. One or two last questions. It's still over here.
Good morning, Mr. Speaker. My question is, first, to preface it, I believe the President has three major opponents. One, of course, the Democrats and the media, second, the media. But how insidious is the Republican establishment? When I look at groups like Club for Growth and how strongly they attempted to eviscerate his candidacy early on, especially in Florida, I'm very concerned about that establishment. And also, Speaker Paul Ryan, can you comment on that?
Oh, look, first of all, I think Paul Ryan's working very hard to cooperate with Trump. But let me, as a former Speaker of the House, let me remind all of you of something every conservative should know. Article 1 of the Constitution is the legislative branch. It's not the executive branch. The Founding Fathers did not design the system so that the Congress rolls over like a puppy and lets the president scratch its tummy. You know, presidents propose, Congresses dispose. This is actually, it's very healthy for America. You get better laws when you have tension. You get better laws if you try to make them bipartisan, because you have to defend them and think them through. You know, so I mean, Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell should cooperate with the president, but not necessarily obey him. The president should work, when he goes up to the gathering in Pennsylvania this weekend, the retreat, he should indicate he wants to cooperate with the Congress, but he's not going to be bound by the limits of the Congress. And that's exactly how the system was designed. And you, madam, get to be the last question. Hold on, she's bringing you a microphone, so everybody can hear your last question.
Thank you. Well, thank you for a wonderful presentation. I'm Shelley Sekula Gibbs from Houston, and you mentioned civil service reform, and I believe a lot of people would be in favor of that. But your contract with America, one of the things that you were unable to do was term limits. And I think a lot of the civil servants might be more accepting of being reformed if Congress could also be reformed in a gentle way. And
look, we tried term limits. I'm happy to go back and try term limits again. I think it has no relationship.
No?
The unions who are going to fight reform are going to fight reform under any circumstance because it radically reduces their power. And all you have to do is look at Scott Walker with 100,000 people in the street, the Capitol occupied for 6 months, and death threats against both Governor Walker and his wife. I mean, this fight's inevitable. It's going to happen, and when it does, the left will go crazy. I mean, it will be. They'll make Saturday look like it was just a warm-up act. Let me say one last introduction to all of you. My wife Calista, who was with me on the dais the other day, is here today and has been putting up with all of these various speeches and ruminations. But next to her is a very dear friend of ours who I want to mention, Joan Lewis. Joan does Joan's Rome on EWTN. And is a correspondent from Rome. And we're thrilled that she's here for the inaugural, and here for the Right to Life March, and so I didn't want to not mention her and the fact that she's now come to Heritage. So she is at one of the great secular shrines of American conservatism. Thank you all very, very much.